In 2022, Merriam-Webster selected gaslighting as its word of the year. The term is heavily circulated across reality television, social media, and pop psychology blogs. But this high public visibility has heavily diluted its meaning. Clinical psychology defines gaslighting as a targeted form of psychological abuse. Its specific objective is the induction of epistemic incompetence, a condition where the victim's capacity for independent judgment is systematically dismantled. Epistemic incompetence describes the moment a person loses the ability to trust their own cognitive capacity. Under this microfracturing pressure, they can no longer rely on their memory, perception of reality, or judgment to make safe decisions. To understand how this abuse functions, we must view it as a calculated structural mechanism used to systematically overwrite another human being's reality. Modern psychology maps the mechanics of this abuse by running decades of literature through rigorous systematic review frameworks. This Prisma flowchart tracks the methodology of a recent scoping review. Researchers started by casting a wide net across global medical and psychological databases, identifying 295 academic records related to the phenomenon. By applying strict exclusion criteria, the researchers filtered out non-clinical literature, opinion pieces, and unverified accounts, removing 212 irrelevant articles. The literature was ultimately distilled down to exactly 14 highly rigorous empirical studies. These papers represent the current clinical consensus on how gaslighting operates in intimate relationships. From this curated dataset, the review isolates 7 distinct categories of analysis. These include risk factors, tactics, motivations, assessment instruments, the harm caused, coping strategies, and associated variables. Relying exclusively on this heavily filtered subset strips away subjective internet interpretations. It leaves us with a purely empirical blueprint of how psychological violence operates. In the early 1960s, the literature defined gaslighting as a perpetrator's attempt to convince third-party institutions, specifically psychiatrists, that a victim had a mental disorder, rendering them unfit for social life. By the 1980s, the clinical understanding shifted. Perpetrators no longer focused on deceiving outside institutions. Instead, the abuser worked to convince the victims themselves of their own mental incapacity. This shift establishes a modern interpersonal dynamic requiring 2 distinct agents, the perpetrator and the victim. The data shows the abuse is heavily dependent on an environment enclosed within societal inequalities and gender stereotypes. A modern gaslighter does not require a psychiatric ward to isolate their target. They leverage existing cultural biases to build the structural walls needed to trap the victim. To understand the perpetrator, we have to look at the psychological traits that predict the execution of this behavior. Recent studies from 2021 to 2024 reveal a strong correlation between gaslighting and the dark tetrad personality traits: psychoticism, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism. These traits drive motivations that are dual in nature, meaning they are not always consciously calculated. Some perpetrators operate with conscious goals, like financial greed or intentionally provoking a breakup. Others are driven by unconscious impulses, specifically the need to control a partner or avoid accountability for misconduct, such as infidelity. Identifying these predictors prevents therapists and victims from misclassifying gaslighting as a mutual communication issue. It is an abusive mechanism executed by individuals exhibiting specific, aversive personality traits. With the profile established, the data outlines the tactical execution layer, how they actively weaponize that systemic boundary against the victim. A primary mechanism of reality distortion is weaponizing gendered language. Perpetrators use insults like hysterical to legitimize the invalidation of the victim's judgment. They pair this with double-bind communication, creating an environment where the victim is always deemed incorrect. The abuse is reinforced through forced social isolation, severing their access to external reality checks. These tactics operate as coordinated attacks designed to strip targets of their independent self-confidence, ensuring they have no choice but to accept the reality imposed by the perpetrator. Skepticism often surrounds psychological abuse due to its invisible nature. However, gaslighting is now actively quantified in clinical settings. This table tracks an expansion of psychometric tools validated recently, explicitly designed to measure the severity of this exposure. Instruments like the Victim Gaslighting Questionnaire and the Gaslighting Behavior Questionnaire have been globally validated in countries spanning Pakistan, Israel, and the United States. The creation of these empirical tools officially elevates gaslighting from a subjective interpersonal complaint into a standardized, measurable public health issue. The psychological consequence of this exposure structurally compromises the victim. They suffer a persistent loss of self-confidence and develop a severe induced dependency on the abuser's perception. Clinical data documents long-lasting emotional trauma and significantly higher levels of depression that persist well after the immediate abuse stops. To counteract this damage, clinical case reports and qualitative investigations point to a primary, evidence-backed strategy for recovery: severing the relationship entirely. Terminating the relationship is almost always a mandatory clinical prerequisite. Without removing the perpetrator's constant reality distortion, the victim cannot begin the process of rebuilding epistemic trust in themselves. While this abstract provides a strong empirical foundation, the scoping review authors explicitly note a methodological limitation. The current clinical data is composed predominantly of female convenient samples. Because the existing literature heavily skews toward female victims, future cross-cultural research must expand its demographic focus to determine if these specific gender dynamics and tactics hold universally. Gaslighting is a highly structured, targeted attack on a person's cognitive reality. By understanding the specific predictors, the weaponized tactics, and the validated psychometrics, clinicians and researchers have the tools to identify, measure, and treat this devastating form of psychological violence.